Hey everyone, welcome back to the Them Before Us podcast in our special series on IVF. What happens when IVF becomes right? I'm Jen Friesen, your host, and we're joined as always by our engagement director, patient Sunny. Today, we continue our series with a special guest, Kathryn Francisco. She's a woman who was born from donor conception and has done advocacy work, sharing her story and supporting restorative reproductive medicine. She's previously served 6 years as operations manager for Canavox, the Marriage and Family Project of the Weatherspoon Institute, and 3 years for the International Institute for Restorative Reproductive Medicine as secretariat. She met her husband while living in New Jersey and now supports him full-time while raising their children in sunny Naples, Florida. She's here to share her story with us and her opinion about IVF and donor conception and all the things we've been engaging with on the show. And she's been a longtime friend and fellow advocate of the Them Before Us organization. Well, I should say of Katie Faust before we even were an organization. And we're so thankful to have you on the podcast. Welcome, Kathryn.
Thanks for having me, Jennifer and Patience.
We'd love to just have you start by sharing your personal story. And it's almost like, how did you get involved with this topic? It's like, well, it wasn't your choice per se, but we would just love to hear, what brought you to this point.
So I was pretty oblivious to this stuff until I was almost 22. My parents sat me down and told me that I was conceived through sperm donation, which was shocking to me. I had kind of signs growing up that weren't glaring to me because I really look like my mom, and people said that to me. But my brother didn't feel that way about our dad. So we were raised in a man-woman home. I have one full sibling. They were told, if you want another sibling, my brother's 4 years older than me. My parents were told, if you want another sibling for your son, then this sperm donor is leaving in the next year. And so then I was conceived. And they had tried several times. I think I have 2 full siblings in heaven too. So it was definitely a long journey for my mom. My dad, who raised me, I think he had the sense that he had infertility just because of past health issues. And they didn't really know, I think, until they were married and, not getting pregnant. Well, I guess the old school way of doing donor conception, where it was, they were encouraged to lie to us. They signed a form at the hospital saying, we are the parents, so we will be raising the children. Almost like washing away the fact that my father was a resident at that hospital and that was my actual father, So I see donor conception as just coated in lies. And, it starts off with these ugly, disconnected acts, like bodily acts. There's pornography involved. There's, again, lying, especially in my case. It's becoming, I think, more common to do non-anonymous donation, but even still, you're still creating, 20 kids who won't be raised by their natural father. Full brother ended up finding our father, and we met him several years ago. I don't remember the exact number. I think it was 6 years ago. We met him in person because it was like the year before I got married. And I met him, and my husband actually said, he could tell that I was then ready to get married. I had just felt really unsettled. So 3 weeks after my trip to Kansas City to meet my father, my husband proposed. So we got married the next year. And since then, we've had at least, I want to say, 5 or 6 half siblings show up, some through DNA testing. 2 were through my biological father's marriage, they're pretty estranged from the family. But I met him the night before I met my father. And my siblings have been such a gift because they understand the suffering. And one of them, his mom told him when he was 7. So for him, he at least had the benefit of growing up with the news, but it was still really hard to hear that when he was 7 too. And it's still a suffering. So yeah, that's kind of my background and my family tree at the moment. It's always growing.
Yeah, in your story you share on the website, you talk about light bulb moments growing up. You didn't understand them in context, that you felt maybe disconnected from your social father, or you felt like maybe your parents were not telling you the truth. Can you describe some of those moments just growing up? You said you learned about this when you were in your 20s. What things did you experience growing up that made you feel disconnected in some way?
Yeah, just for example, looking at my nose, no one in my family had the same nose as me on either side of the family. And when you look at my father, it's like, wow, I have his exact nose. So there's no surprise there. My brother sent me a photo of him before we met him, and I started crying because I look just like him. So that was one example. Another one is just moments with our dad where we were out to breakfast or something, and we really didn't talk that much. We would just kind of sit there. And he had kind of, I think, subconsciously or unconsciously disconnected when I was in college. He just stopped reaching out as much. Looking back, it's possible this was in the time period before I found out, where it was awkward because my brother knew for 8 months before I did. So it's possible my dad was just avoiding me because he didn't want to have the conversation. But my brother said that, if you don't tell Katie, that's what my family calls me. If you don't tell Katie, in 8 months, I'm going to tell her. And 8 months, almost to the day, is when they told me. Yeah.
Can you say a little bit more about when they did tell you, when you first found out? What questions did that answer or create for you?
Oh man, I just felt so horrible.
Mhm.
And I wanted to go into a hole and hide. I literally left my parents' house and I wanted to go to a movie theater and watch a movie. That's all I wanted to do. I ended up going to a friend's house who was in between my parents' house and our University of Florida. So I showed up to her parents' house and her mom said, "Oh, you are so loved." And that's just not how I felt. I felt like trash. Someone wrote a New York Times piece where he did a photo exhibit of all of his siblings, and he, throughout the stories, you get the sense, and some people even specifically say, I feel like a statistic being donor conceived. When you're in a natural family, there's your family and that's it. And you fit there. Even if you don't feel like you fit in all the time or something, you at least can rest in the place of your family. And, you only have a few siblings, if any. But when you're created in this way, it just creates a sense of like I just don't matter, and like I wasn't first choice. My parents' first choice would obviously have been to get pregnant naturally. That's everyone's first choice. So those are kind of the immediate emotions that honestly haven't gone away. But I have found a lot of healing through my marriage and through my faith. Yeah, God has definitely been good to me. So
Yeah. Yeah, thank you for sharing that. When you shared your story in the public discourse, you described your reaction to seeing a woman's Facebook post about considering becoming an egg donor and the one-sided empathy that she expressed. Can you tell our audience about that experience? How does donor conception show empathy for the parents at the expense of the child?
yeah, it's just kind of, the adults are in our faces, so it's easy to have compassion for them. I even had a moment in college where I had compassion for couples who are infertile, and I suggested in a blog post there are methods that they can have children now. But I felt really weird saying that and eerie, and I think I ended up not publishing the post, or I turned it into my class. It was like one of 10 blog posts or something I had to do for a journalism class. I ended up not like going back and advertising this blog or something. I felt weird about it because it it's just not thinking of where children are meant to be. and what's best for them. I was actually talking to Katie Faust about this a few months ago, just how several of my siblings have actually been to jail or prison, and I don't think they've gone to college. And she said that confirms research by Brad Wilcox, that you're actually more likely to be imprisoned than go to college if you are raised without your biological father. And it's true. It's not good to not have your biological father. That's why I think, with adoption, it's become more of the norm to have open adoption. With donor conception, it's more the norm to have open donors. But all the same, you're still not being raised by your natural parents. And so where adoption kind of is trying to heal and take care of a tough situation, donor conception is actually creating that situation intentionally. It's madness. If people really thought about it and they looked at the research, then it would be illegal.
You've drawn a contrast between donor conception and adoption. A lot of people, like to point out, well, hey, we can get kids that aren't related to us in this other way over here. So what's the difference? Or they really focus on the fact that adults want a biological connection to children. So that's why they shouldn't adopt. Can you help us understand, are there similarities between these two ways to get a child, or are they completely different? Is one preferable over the other?
Yeah, if there are plenty of children who need to be adopted, so that's a no-brainer. Children aren't products, so you don't have a right to a child with someone else. If I'm fertile but my husband isn't, I don't have a right to make another man have children with me. That's not a right. So sure, some men might volunteer that, but still that's creating the situation I just talked about, where you're intentionally creating a child outside of a relationship with their father.
Yeah, I think that's really good. And as done before us, we've highlighted adoption needs to be child-centric, and there really isn't a way for donor conception to be child-centric. It is ultimately about the decisions of the adults involved, not
100%.
the children. Yeah. You briefly mentioned the ways that your marriage helped you heal from learning about your donor conception. Can you tell us what was that process like? What were some of the other factors that contributed to that healing journey as well?
Oh man. Yeah. So when I was engaged, actually two of my three donor conceived contacts were going through divorce or on the brink of divorce. And the third was in counseling for her marriage. So they just all struggled with marriage. So I was really stressed because I had the sense that I could not function properly enough to have a healthy marriage when I'm looking around and everyone who's like me is not in a good spot. But I actually converted to Catholicism 10 years ago, actually this year. And I've had a lot of support. First of all, through the church, they support children being conceived naturally, because other methods like IVF or donor conception are an affront to a child's dignity, and the church recognizes that. So that was very comforting to me. And it also fosters this culture of marrying wisely. You have to, without going into detail, the Catholic Church could do a much better job at, screening for marriage. But just for example, like, you have to say that you're not marrying your first cousin, and you have to meet with a priest. And there are certain checklist items that they check in with you. So will you be open to life? Well, that's important, because a marriage that is complete is one where you're fully giving yourself to your spouse. And so you kind of ask yourself these questions going into it. Can I fully give myself to this person? And that's, if I can't, then I shouldn't get married, period. So it made me think about, am I capable, and am I choosing a person who can handle my baggage well? And I did, and it was really hard because he was a really good guy, and he was very different than the guys that I had dated in the past, where, they weren't ready or they wanted to use me. And that's kind of what I was looking for because that's how I felt about myself. So I think that's the sad part when you come from a dysfunctional family, where it's not even a true family. It's like patched together by these practices. You look for the wrong things in a spouse and you're seeking validation. And that's exactly where I was. So I leaned a lot on my friends and my brain. And there were a lot of signs, not to sound superstitious, but just my husband and I both experienced things where we're like, wow, I can't believe that you also, just like silly things, deep things all over the place. Um, and he was very patient with me in my struggles of abandonment, feeling like I might be abandoned by him. And then also dealing with some of my family dysfunction. He was patient with me, helped me kind of think through things. And to this day, we act as a team. And that's what marriage is getting on the same team with someone and, working through conflict together, just everything. So, yeah, I'm really grateful that we were able to get married and that I had supportive friends who were encouraging me in it. And that he was, he would point out when it was kind of crazy, and he would also point out his own limits for my needs. And that was really helpful. Just, yeah, it became this like little safe haven where it's not like he didn't act like I was perfect, and he also didn't act like he could change me. And that really challenged me to kind of face my problems.
Yeah, thanks for sharing. I mean, you said you've learned this like 6 years ago. I mean, I think it's so hard for people who probably aren't in this situation to fathom. It's not just that you were raised by a single mom and you didn't know your dad, and then your dad shows up. It's that what you thought was true and your experience of like, this is my mom and this is my dad, felt there were some things about it that fell off or whatever it was. But then to be sat down and told, just earth shattering changes. So, what was it like? Okay, so you learned that your social dad is not your biological father. You said you said you met your biological dad 6 years ago, I think is what you said. Maybe you learned.
Yeah, I found out 13 years ago.
13 years ago, yeah.
Mhm.
But you're still, I mean, you're processing, right? I mean, how do these are huge concepts for someone to process. So when you met him, yeah, what was that like? That first face to face of like, this is the person I came from. You've never met him before. You don't know him. I don't know if you'd seen a picture or something. Can you just tell us a little bit about what that experience was like?
Yeah, I had seen a picture and I had talked to him on the phone a couple of times. And I had even talked to his cousin on the phone, and she and I sounded similar in our voices, the way we said things, even though we grew up in different parts of the country. So meeting him was so awesome because I walked up to his door. He opens it and he just looks like a dad. He's got like the dad body, he's got the dad baldness. And he was mine, he was my dad. And it felt so good to just spend time with him. We sat in a restaurant and talked for something like 3 or 4 hours, and to kind of feel at peace. Like it just felt really natural. He listened really well. He liked talking a lot. That's kind of all of my siblings and I get this from him, where we like to talk a lot. We have to think out loud a lot, but we also are good listeners. And he's like that. And that's why he was a psychiatrist for so long. So yeah, meeting him was such a gift. I don't keep in touch with him a lot. That's kind of the process where I am now. You talked about processing. It takes a long time. It's over the whole lifetime. So as more daughters have popped up and live closer to him, and as my life has become more of I'm like living in a little cocoon with my children, taking care of my husband. So I don't always have time to call, and I don't always make time to call. And I should, but it's also, I have this sense that maybe it's a fear really that I will disappoint him. And and it's not so mutual. Like he'll never be able to visit me. He's just not in the place to do that. So part of me just doesn't want my heart to be broken again, you know. So I'm kind of in this weird spot where I recognize and I love him as my father, but I also don't want to get too close because of the reality of how our relationship started.
Yeah, that makes sense. Well, and can I ask you too, now that you have children, so you're married and you have kids, has that felt healing? I mean, in the sense that now you can look at your children and you know that you and your husband are offering them something you didn't have. I think a lot of people feel that at some level, right? Oh, I'm able to give my kids something I didn't have growing up.
Yes, totally. It is so moving to see our daughter. She's 11 months now, but when she was first born, even as a newborn, she would like see him across the room and just lock eyes on him and watch him walk across the house. And she didn't do that to anyone else. It was just her dad. Seeing like how young children recognize their father. Obviously, babies recognize their mother, but their father. Um, how early she said dada. You know, she still can't say her brother's name, but it's like mama and dada are their first words always. It's been it has been healing to see them have a relationship with him,
That's awesome.
look like him, you
Yeah,
know.
right.
And it's also our marriage is healing for me, for them, and that we do resolve conflict. We openly have fights in front of them, but we also openly come back together and talk. So it's not this thing where it's not fake, it's not unhealthy. It's working through conflict. You know, I want them, and they will just know, like, it's impossible to hide conflict from your kids because they're always around.
Yeah,
So
sure.
I love that they kind of see the ebb and flow of what marriage is in
Sure.
us.
I have one more and then I'll let patients get a word in edgewise. But
Yeah.
yeah, so I'm just thinking you've probably got a lot of different kinds of reactions when you've been sharing your story publicly. People who,
Yes.
hey, be happy you're alive, or maybe people who maybe it's a little too much the other way and like your life is so horrible, you'll never be fixed again, or are there
Exactly.
misconceptions? So maybe some reactions to you, or are there misconceptions about donor conceived people?
Just have to keep in mind that the child always suffers when they're not with their mom and their dad. So that's probably the biggest thing I have to explain when I'm trying to explain the differences between donor conception and adoption. I use adoption a lot to kind of point to the child suffering because I don't think adoption is given enough credit for the child suffering. And sometimes it is encouraged to abandon your child. And sometimes it is encouraged to adopt because you have to have children and it's all about you. And that's not good for the kids who are being adopted. It's also not good for the adults to have this mindset like they deserve something. You know, that's the opposite of parenting. Natural parenting is a huge sacrifice. I'm 8.5 months pregnant right now, chasing my 11-month-old daughter who can walk around the house and trying to manage her and my son who's 4. And it's a huge sacrifice. Like, I can't even sleep through the night right now, and I really need to because I'm about to give birth. So that's it's like a preparation for parenting. And then, yeah, I have gotten, you should be grateful you're alive. People, especially before I was Catholic, when I was kind of evangelical Christian, they just didn't understand my suffering. And there was a lot of pushing that, like, just be positive, be grateful. We love your parents, they're awesome. I'm like, obviously, I love my parents. That's a non-issue. but I still have this great suffering, and people just couldn't handle it. And my parents, even to their credit, my mom and her husband, when I say my parents, that's what I mean. They were told by a pastor that it was fine to use a sperm donor. So I think, and that's actually something I talk about, is the compassion for infertile couples, because they're given a lot of bad information and they're desperate. Infertility is a desperation. And people do things when they're desperate that aren't good. We all make bad decisions when we're desperate. So yeah. Yeah, those are things. I think I said this in my public discourse article, but I can be grateful and thrive and live my life and still be against the way that I was conceived, because I know the suffering that it causes. And in the end, like you guys have talked about, it's a commodification of children, and it cannot be child-centric to use donor conception. Yeah.
That's really good. And I appreciate too you bringing that child-centric emphasis in adoption as well. As the sibling of an adoptee and aunt of several adoptees, I've seen firsthand every adoption begins with loss. And I'm grateful for ways that I've seen elements of the adoption movement really recognizing that and helping parents understand that more. But there still is a lot of misunderstanding there too. And I think that misunderstanding, like you said, informs the way that people then continue to also misunderstand the experience of people who are donor conceived as well, where there's that blindness to that loss.
Yes, definitely. I see the kind of misunderstandings around adoption as prepping culture for sperm donation and egg donation, and saying biology doesn't matter. We're just going to be positive about adoption. And so if you're so positive, then people start to think the natural family doesn't matter and biology doesn't matter. And then they just think they can do whatever they want.
Yeah, absolutely. So, one of the reasons that this series is happening is, we're looking at, we've got a new administration that on the campaign trail made promises about IVF, hinted at potentially federal subsidization of IVF. And according to CDC data, nearly 1 in 10 IVF cycles uses donor eggs or embryos. And the CDC doesn't currently track how many babies are conceived via sperm donation, but estimates suggest that it's between 30 to 60,000 babies per year. So you've got 10% of IVF cycles plus the 30 to 60 babies conceived through sperm donation. And I think it's fair to say that if federal IVF subsidization happens, we would probably see more solo IVF cycles or donor conception cycles. Can you share your perspective on that as, someone who is donor conceived? How's that going to affect kids? How's that going to affect the adults who are struggling with infertility as well?
Yeah, IVF is I hate IVF. It's not good for adults. It causes cancer in young women. It teaches people to think that they can surpass their bodily disease and just have children. There are ways to heal that actually allow your fertility to thrive. So for couples who are natural couples having, desiring children, I've had 3 miscarriages, and I think part of it was, I'll never really know, but my thyroid levels were a little bit low. My vitamin D was low. Just a Google search, vitamin D being low is actually a cause of miscarriage, or it's a contraindication, whatever. I also have, at various points, this baby in my belly would not be here if it weren't for my doctor giving me progesterone right after I gave birth, because I saw that my cycle was back. I saw that I was having a healthy ovulation even though I was breastfeeding. And I texted her and I said, hey, I'm positive I'm ovulating. So can you send me a prescription, because I'm traveling? And she did. And I know that's why I'm still pregnant. Like, I know that's why my baby survived. There's so much that we know about, especially women's health, that can cure infertility. And most doctors don't know it. So if we're going to fund something federally, that's what we should be funding. A progesterone prescription costs me what, like $35? How much does an IVF cycle cost? Like a down payment on a house? It's crazy expensive. you're pumping hormones into your body, and then they don't even work most of the time. It's, what is it, like a 30% success rate or 15%? I can't remember what the success rate is. And just to add to my kind of tangent, this is all called restorative reproductive medicine, when you restore bodily function in many ways, and the end result is that you get your fertility back. And I have a niece or nephew on the way, actually, because one of my siblings had surgery. It's, men have their issues too. He had surgery, and now they were able to conceive children. So that's restorative reproductive medicine, and it makes you a whole person. It restores your health. IVF circumvents that, where you're still going to be dealing with these health issues on top of likely failure to actually have children. And it's mega expensive. It's not dealing with the dignity of the person who wants to have kids. So as far as the donor conception aspect, I think, society is kind of going to hell in a handbag with this, and we just have to keep emphasizing the needs of the child, and I think point to the commodification aspect of it. And I don't have like a one quick fix solution, but we definitely shouldn't be funding fatherlessness and motherlessness when we know what that means.
Yeah, that's really
That's
good. And I
how to
appreciate
fix
that you
it.
brought up restorative reproductive medicine. We're actually kicking off this series. For those who are jumping in mid-series, our first episode is with a former IVF doctor who now practices restorative reproductive medicine. And then coming up at the end of this series, we are also talking with someone who specializes in restorative reproductive medicine and surgical interventions for couples dealing with infertility. So be sure to catch those episodes as well. I also just want to ask you, Kathryn, for our listeners who were conceived via donor conception, or maybe they're a couple struggling with infertility who is considering donor conception, what would you say to someone in those situations where they're wrestling either with finding out something about their past or wondering if this is a route that they should go down? What would you say to them?
I would just share my story and encourage them. I'd encourage them toward restorative reproductive medicine. And, if they've already addressed that, then obviously, and they really feel the draw to be parents, then I would push them towards the foster system or adoption, encourage that route. But I think I would also, I don't know. People don't respond well when they're dealing with infertility, and either you have kids or you don't know or you've never dealt with infertility. They don't respond well if I said this to someone once. Your marriage provides so much good, even, outside of children. And she said that's a load of poo. So I think when someone's in that deep of suffering, you just have to pray for them and empathize. It's probably the best thing to do. In addition to, kind of feeling out where their heart is. Do they really want to raise children, or is it just a blow that this thing is out of their control?
Yeah.
Because some people are infertile and they end up not adopting. Everyone kind of has their own journey with it.
Yeah, thank you. That's really good. How about someone who was donor conceived and this is new information for them? Do you have any advice for them as they're navigating that new information?
Just not to give up on their dignity. Yeah. Like, it's okay to find your family. You should. It's good for you to, even if you find them, they don't want a relationship, at least you have some kind of closure because you found them, And if they don't want a relationship, that's their loss. And they're jerks. Yeah. I think it's really hard to feel like you are dignified when you're conceived in this way. So if you can just um, always defend and kind of learn to be confident that it will go a long way.
When you said it so beautifully, even just in this conversation, but I'm sure I've written about it before, it's okay to disagree with, have a problem with, be hurt by the ethics of how you were conceived, and still be thankful you're alive, still make something beautiful out of your life. And, we're people of faith, most of us who work for them before us and are on the board, you're a person of faith. And so we're just thankful for your life. And we're just really thankful that you are open to sharing your story and encouraging people, because at Them Before Us, we believe the power of story is kind of where people who've been against a lot of this, the negative things, the abuses of technology, we haven't told good stories. We've talked about data, and we've talked about here's the facts and philosophy. And so when people can share their stories and say, well, this is how these technologies have victimized me or commodified me, this is why we should not do it, that's very impactful for helping change hearts and minds. So Kathryn, thank you so much for joining us and sharing.
God bless your work, and both of you. That's beautiful. Thank you for sharing patience. You have adopted siblings and nieces and nephews. It's important. Your perspective is important too.
Everyone, we hope you appreciated this conversation. Consider sharing it with some folks who maybe have not considered this perspective before. Hope you enjoy the series, and we'll put some show notes and different ways you can read more of Kathryn's work and her story in our show notes. Thank you, everyone, for listening and for joining the Them Before Us movement. Hey, everyone. Welcome back to the Them Before Us podcast. You are joining one of our staff hangout, interview, follow-up episodes with Patience and Josh. Welcome, both of you.
Good to be here.
Hey, Jen.
And we are following up the conversation we had with Kathryn Francisco, which was so good. She's kind of a longtime friend of our Them Before Us organization. She and Katie Faust have known each other for a long time, because Kathryn shared her story with Katie and then shared her story on her website. And so this conversation was awesome because she was sharing her experience as someone who discovered at age 22 that her social father was not her biological father. And she talked about back in that time, 20 something years ago, or 15 years ago, that people were really encouraged to lie to their children about the circumstances. Hey, you're using a sperm donor. I don't think you could even use an egg donor as far as like maybe 30, 40 years ago. I'm not sure. But sperm donation has been around for a little bit longer. And they were told, you just need to tell her you're the parents and just push forward like that. But she picked up on a lot of things with the man she believed was her biological father. She just sensed things were off. I don't look quite like you. He doesn't feel sort of connected or invested in me. And she just talked about the difficulty of growing up and feeling that disconnect, not knowing why, learning the truth. She has a full brother, she said, and he knew the truth about 8 months before her. That was difficult. And then just the process of meeting her biological father, but then what that impact has been on her as she's gotten married, as she's had kids, as she's navigated relationships with half siblings. So it was a really interesting conversation, but that's just kind of the summary to kick us off. Patience, what did you think about it?
I really appreciate Kathryn's vulnerability and being willing to share. Obviously this is something that's hard for her. And, she acknowledged that in the conversation, and her willingness to put her story forward and to say, hey, here's how I was hurt by this, while also having such grace for her parents and recognizing her own value and dignity. Saying, hey, I have value. I have dignity. I am worthwhile, and it is good that I exist. And also, the circumstances of my conception were wrong, and they were unethical, and I've been hurt by that. And I recognize that my parents weren't given good information. They were told by their pastor that this was just fine. They were told by the fertility clinic that it would be best to deceive me and to keep that information from me. She's balancing these things, and she's doing so in a really beautiful and compassionate way. And so I'm really glad that we were able to have her as a guest, that we had the opportunity to hear her story and to share that with our audience, because I think she brings a lot of really good nuance to the conversation, where she's processed a lot of these things, and she said she's still processing them, but she's working through them in a way that is really honoring to her parents, and it shows God's work in her life, that she's able to have compassion towards what her parents experienced, and also take a firm stance saying, hey, this was wrong and this should not have happened, and I am the victim of this. But without delving into a bitter victim mentality where she feels like she can't move forward in her life because of it. So yeah, really appreciated the way that she tells her story, and just the experience that she brings to this series.
There's a couple of things that stood out to me. And again, for those that may be off put by the term social father or biological father, keep in mind that these are often terms that people who are donor conceived use. It's ways of differentiating these different things. It's not meant to be derogatory toward a certain individual in a person's life, but descriptive of the relationship that this person has, whether they call them dad or not, or anything like that. But again, it gets into the complicated nature of all this. I mean, Kathryn saying, I saw a picture of my donor or biological dad, and I immediately knew where my nose came from. These are just things that we don't understand. Like, I have no concept of that. I don't have any idea of what that would make me feel. Then she said, I felt like second choice, which again, I hadn't. The narrative we often hear from parents is, look how much I did to make you. Look how much I paid to create you. Look how out of my way I had to go to make this possible. But her experience is, oh, I was a second choice. You would have preferred a biological child, which again, there's a lot of validity to that, and how she would experience it. So again, just like that stuff, just it was hard to process and felt so foreign to me for good reason.
I don't know if you guys noticed this as much. I watched them multiple times because I'm editing, so I'm more on the production side of it. But it really stood out to me that when we asked her the question about what it was like to meet your biological father for the first time, she actually lit up. And not that there is no complexity in that relationship, because she talks about that. There is complexity, and they're not super, super close. But it was fascinating to see sort of a joy and that recognition just come across her face as she started to talk about what it was like to meet him or know who he was. And it reminds me of something we say at Them Before Us, that it's really hard to know who you are. Who am I? Until I know whose am I? Who do I belong to? Who did I come from? And it's interesting because she thought she came from some people, but knew there was a disconnect. But when to actually meet the person, yes, that's where my nose came from. But there's also access to so many people you didn't know before. Oh, my paternal grandparents are these people, or I hear stories about them, or now I know, what country they immigrated from, or now I know my aunts and uncles. It is, like Josh, you said, it's so fascinating that we three have never had to look in the mirror and wonder, where is my dad? Like, where did I actually come from? But some people might push back and say, hey, well, adopted kids also deal with that. And so really it's not that different. And I'll just make one comment about that before I get your thoughts on it. Is adoption different from donor conception? But we've talked about this, and we have stat on the website. Donor conceived kids actually fare more poorly than adopted kids, even when the donor conceived kid has one of their biological parents. So this is a good example. Kathryn had her biological mom and a sperm donor as a biological father that she never knew. And the outcomes for those kids are actually worse in a lot of ways than what adopted kids' outcomes are, who might have no biological connection. And one of the big differences we theorize is that, especially once they become aware of it, someone who's from sperm or egg donation has to wrestle with the fact that their parent did it intentionally. you did this to me on purpose for good reason or for whatever. You can justify all of it. But at the end of the day, you decided I would never get to know my mom or dad. An adopted kid can still feel so many different feelings, and I'm disconnected. I'll never know my mom and dad. But there's still a sense of I lost those people, but these adoptive parents came and got me and chose me and brought me into their family intentionally. They didn't cause the pain to me intentionally. So that's a really fascinating difference that we've seen in the data.
That adoptive part is that neither of the two people who raised me had anything to do with this. And in fact, if we're thinking about this in our best light, our best angels, they would want me to have been raised in the loving, safe home of my biological parents too. That there's a wound that I have that they recognize and affirm, and know that while they are seeking to redeem it as best they can, that this is something that's real and hurts me. That is not available to someone who intentionally pays this sperm donor to never be a part of their life again or to play no meaningful role. That is not you are a part of it. And that's a whole different, right? The psychological aspects of that are completely different.
Yeah, and when Kathryn was talking about, who do I look like, and some of those questions, I really saw a parallel between that and the experience of a lot of adoptees in my life. And everybody's experience is different. And so some of the adoptees in my life really want to know who their biological parents are, who do I look like? They want to meet their family. Others haven't reached a point where they want that, and maybe never will. But like Jen was pointing out, that there is that difference between adoption and donor conception, because in one case that loss was intentional and created by the people who are raising you, and in the other, the people who are raising you recognize that loss and would have, like you said, Josh, would have wanted you to have that connection with your biological parents. And um, I think, when people pursue donor conception, a lot of the time, the reason that they're doing that is, they express a desire to have that biological connection with their child. And like Kathryn said in our interview, it's a one-sided empathy, where you have empathy for the couple that you can see and that you can talk to, and they want a child that's related to them. But the flip side is that child also wants to know the people that they're related to, and the baby can't express
Bingo.
that. And so often, the voices of donor conceived individuals are kind of crowded out of the conversation. Kathryn mentioned, when she first found out, going to her friend's house and her friend's mom, it said, "Oh, you are so loved," rather than recognizing and validating the loss that Kathryn felt and the betrayal that she felt of having been deceived for so many years. And I think, when that's the experience of so many donor conceived individuals, there isn't space for them to really express what they've gone through. And so the experience of the adults keeps getting privileged and centered there. And I think even there's a parallel with adoption, where, there was a time when adoption was kept secret, and it was typical to not tell a child that they had been adopted. And then also, that there was a time when adoptees didn't always have a lot of space to talk about the loss that they felt, and they were immediately shut down with, "Oh, but you're so loved." And it's absolutely true. They are so loved. And kids who are donor conceived are also so loved. But it doesn't mean that the loss wasn't real. And it doesn't mean that what they're feeling should just be minimized and dismissed. They should have space to process that, and they should have space to be able to reckon with, their wish to have been raised by their biological parents, and to know their extended family, and to be able to look in the mirror and know where they came from. Because that's something that so many of us take for granted. I get told that I look so much like my mom and I look so much like my dad. And, I can see both. And it's really hard for someone who can't see either, or who can't see one.
I'd point out too, again, highlighting the prevalence of this issue and some of the implications of donor conception. Number one, I can imagine, I'm trying to imagine what it would be like to be told you have potentially 40, 50 siblings. That's, I would feel like a commodity.
Mm.
Again, we're just not used to, human beings aren't used to saying we have 40 siblings. Again, that would make me feel like I am a product. How special am I when there's 40 of me out there, my siblings? Again, this is because it's an unnatural process. This isn't how it was meant to work. And even a man and a woman getting married, it's pretty complicated to have 40 children. That would be, again, it's not something we've processed or dealt with as a society. So the commodification, the feeling, unnaturally unique, that would be really difficult. There's also the issues of how, again, talking about the Wild West, like we've said in so many episodes, fertility fraud, the number of states even that ban it. Yeah, patients, you probably know better offhand how many states actually have regulations saying the doctor can't swap their sperm in for the donor and not tell anybody. I mean, we don't even have regulations to deal with this because it feels like such an uncharted arena of law. On top of that, we may think this is, well, how often is someone like Kathryn, how many Kathryns really are there out? There's not that many. And it's good to highlight her going home to a mother and a father, but we have to keep in mind, for every same-sex couple that creates a child, they are creating Kathryn's situation. They're creating a motherless or fatherless child. And again, we would highlight that Kathryn went home to a mother and a father, but every one of the same-sex couples that take a child home, they are having no male or female connection too. And again, I would just highlight asking those children. You see the Instagram and TikTok videos of them asking for, where is my dad? Where is my mom? And they get pretty quickly shut down, saying, well, you have two moms that love you. Well, you can be a really great mom. A mother can't ever be the dad. You can't ask the child, well, which one of your parents would you have replaced? Which one wasn't necessary? You can't do that. Again, it just struck me as I was listening to Kathryn, how often are those voices elevated? How often are we asking the people who had to pay the price for the consequences of these decisions, how they felt about these issues? And in the case of IVF and so many of the children that are aborted or lose their life in this process, well, they really don't ever get a chance to advocate for how this process of creating children was detrimental to them. Even though we get Kathryn, she lived through the process, was obviously born. So many don't even get that chance too.
Yeah, and we think about this with a few different kinds of scenarios, right? We've got at them before us. We talk about same-sex parenting. We talk about divorce. We talk about single parenthood by choice. We talk about donor conception. We talk a little bit about trans ideology and the parents that are involved in that. And so there does seem to be a bit of a consistent theme of kind of all those adults on one side and adoptive parents on the other. All things being equal, like these are all loving, safe people. The problem is when we're dealing with someone who, I fell in love with my secretary, I want to get a divorce. I fell in love with someone of the same sex and I want to repartner over there, or I chose sperm or egg donor, or I transitioned my children. The problem is when the adult desires start to come against what we know is good for kids, or even if your kid starts to tell you this was not good for me, or I'm struggling, you're with same-sex women. I have two moms. And people will share on Reddit, my son or daughter has started saying, where's my dad? Or glomming onto men at the park because they're so desperate for a father. The problem is a lot of these adults have to start kind of gaslighting their kids and being like, hey, you don't have a dad. You don't have a dad. You don't need a dad. Isn't it enough that this female partner is the one who likes cars and plays at the park? Or, the divorced parents are like, hey, you get 2 Christmases now. And, kids are very resilient. And don't my kids want me to be happy? Or the single parenthood by choice is, don't I deserve a child? And don't I deserve to be biologically connected? And kind of to your point, Patience, about adoption and how it shifted to open adoption. And Katie will share about this as an adoptive parent. The difference is when a healthy adoptive parent is acknowledging what went wrong in that child's life, that, hey, this was not the ideal. I can't answer all these questions for you, but I understand it's hard. I'm not just telling you, suck it up and your biological family doesn't matter. That's really against sort of the best practices that people, you can be equipped now as adoptive parents with a lot of classes and education and, hearing from adoptees. And it can really shape how we interact with kids that we've adopted. But it's really difficult to kind of get adults in a lot of these other places to acknowledge these things would be bad for children. That's why you should not do it. Or even harder, they've already made those choices. Well, now you have to do something really hard. And you have to tell your kid, I know what I did was wrong. And I put you in a situation where now you're bearing more pain. I should have been bearing it, but I put it on you. And that is a really difficult place for adults to be.
Yeah, and I think so often the reluctance to acknowledge that loss is because you would have to say, hey, I'm the reason that this went wrong. And I think adults are, it's painful to acknowledge that, and also kind of scary of, how's my kid going to respond? And what if they never forgive me? And I think that's where, um, bringing the gospel into the story as well is a really important piece, making it clear, hey, there is forgiveness and there is hope of something better, even in light of the worst things that have happened. So I think, being able to give people a path forward, saying, hey, there is grace. Yes, what you did is wrong. Yes, it caused pain for your child. But that doesn't mean that it's unforgivable and that there's no hope of ever reconciling. And I think that's a piece that Kathryn really highlighted nicely, just in the way that she tells her story, where she's able to see, hey, that what happened was wrong, and I was hurt by that, and also, you know, there is hope. She still has a good relationship with her parents who raised her, and I think my guess is that the way that she has talked about and processed this has given them some space to really you know consider, hey, here's what we did, and also there's grace. So I think she's a beautiful example of what it looks like to navigate that, as the person who was hurt by the decision, and also in a way that gives hope to the people who have chosen donor conception, and now they're in a spot where they need to think through, hey, what does it look like to support my child through this now that I recognize that I've hurt them. So I appreciated that as well.
And I think if you're noticing that faith and the gospel comes up a lot in these conversations, to be clear, our organization, we don't believe you need the gospel to recognize the very natural structures present in the world around us, that male and female creates a child, and that the child will grow up needing those two people, and they have a right to those two people. And when that goes wrong, things go wrong for that child and for that couple. We think all that's pretty clear just in the natural world. But we do think that all of the unnatural parts, the when we get it wrong, the messiness of raising a family, making bad choices that we've all done, we do think it's pretty impossible to do that without the gospel, to have reconciliation and forgiveness and to put things back together. And so that is where you'll see it so often come up in our language and our talking, is that we do think that's a critical part of this process, because we all do make these kind of mistakes. We all do need forgiveness. We have to have hard conversations with our kids, and it does come out in our worldview that we think navigating these type of, it's hard to think of anything more important than family, that when navigating these, our Christian worldview does equip us with the tools to try to do it well.
Yeah, that's good. She talked a little bit too about a lot of the things we've talked about in this series, or will talk about in this series, about IVF is going around infertility issues. It's making it worse. She was pretty strongly said, I think she said, I hate IVF. She's compassionate for women that are struggling with things and really does not see that as a way to help them. Right. And then in addition, when you're using these technologies that will cause the pain and the hardship that she has endured as well, she's just like, don't do it, and it was cool too. She shared a little bit, like, she's had some struggles with fertility, and they've been able to find some solutions that were not that complicated, that were able to help her get and stay pregnant. And kind of as a final thought, I just thought it was really neat that she shared about her marriage, interacting with her husband's care and compassion for her, and also the way she gets to see her husband interact with their children has been really kind of healing for her. She just is thankful that her children have something she didn't have. She watches them look at him from across the room, follow him around, seeing them get to interact. She just talked about that being really healing, and that was really neat. All right, this has been another great conversation. We hope you all enjoyed it. She was such a great interview, and we'll put links to her interview and her story on the page for you to check out. Consider sharing this with someone who maybe has never heard this perspective before, and start a conversation with someone about IVF, reproductive technologies, and just get into the practice of, you can start a conversation, not even going into it with I have to make them agree with me, but just opening up some conversation. I think that's how we're going to change hearts, change minds, change laws, policies, and protect children. So thanks so much, everyone, for listening to the Them Before Us podcast. Thanks for joining the movement.